about James Madison. Our last one kept getting interrupted by all sorts of buffering and lagging, so hopefully now it's working properly. But yeah, talking about the life and legacy of America's founding father, the fourth U.S. president, James Madison, something we do here all the time, history and social studies of all different types and backgrounds. So let's see. Hopefully the Wi-Fi holds. Sorry for the interruptions, and hopefully I can get through this live stream lecture without any more problems. So James Madison is on the rise in Virginia politically. He's well educated. He went to the College of William and Mary. He gets in good with Thomas Jefferson, who's one of the leading political figures in Virginia at the time. But he's not there for the writing of a Declaration of Independence. He's not as well connected as Jefferson is to the early part of the Revolutionary movement. He does serve in the Virginia military briefly, but he doesn't have a lot of military experience. But he's very young. He's 25 when the Declaration of Independence is signed. He's part of the Virginia House of Burgesses. But Jefferson again takes him under his wing, and he gets to watch the development of political statecraft and the development of a constitutional system through Jefferson, because Jefferson becomes the primary author of Virginia's constitutional state colonial constitution, which become the basis for its state constitution later on. So individual colonies during the American Revolutionary movement after the Declaration of Independence would start developing forms of government that would work for their colonies. These become the colonial and later state constitutions of the 13 original colonies. And James Madison gets to kind of observe that with Thomas Jefferson kind of on the side, watching Thomas Jefferson. Madison will get inspired and become a more prominent political voice. He's never going to be extremely outspoken. He's not one for giving very big speeches, which is something when we think about presidents today, we think a president has to be an excellent or at least charismatic or engaging speaker. James Madison, living in the early 19th century, was not one of those things. Madison, again, if you get kind of a sheepish, bookish view from James Madison, he's vociferously well-read. He's extraordinarily intellectual. There's a lot to like about James Madison's intellect. He's not a physically intimidating individual. We think of George Washington and his leadership abilities and the ability to stand 6'4" and tower over people, and stuff like that. But Madison is very short. He's 5'4". He's one of the shortest presidents in American history. Again, he even in his own time as president, he casts a very small shadow, contrasting with his taller, more vivacious, and much younger wife, who's only in her 40s, while he's in his late 50s and early 60s during his presidency. So, but Logan, I'm not answering questions now. I usually answer them at the end of a live stream, but I'll just say right now, white people did not invent slavery. White people just internationalized it. So the point being, Madison becomes a voice and leader in Virginia politics during and after the Revolution. Eventually he becomes this. He eventually becomes part of a delegation selected to help improve the Articles of Confederation, which was the government set up for the new country after the end of the war. Basically, the founding fathers, worried that the British government had been too powerful and too tyrannical before the revolution and leading up to it, wanted to create a decentralized government that was more of a confederation where the individual states had more power than the federal government did as a whole. And this created what was called the Articles of Confederation, which was a system of government developed in the late 1770s, really fully instituted after the American Revolution ends in 1783. And it's based on this idea of, again, decentralized power, states being able to veto legislation, and very little being unified in terms of economics, in terms of political relationships. States kind of got to do their own thing. This government proved to be very ineffective at actually paying off war debt, paying soldiers from the war, regulating commerce, creating a standardized monetary unit, and all those other things. anyways, so James Madison realizes that a weak central government, a decentralized power, is not going to help the situation. The states are already kind of fracturing. There's not enough central authority to put down rebellions like Shays' Rebellion in 1787. So so Madison and many of the other founding fathers, although Madison has not really fully reached the level of all the other founding fathers of prestige, feel the need and the compulsion to revise and update what they originally created. The Articles of Confederation has left the central federal government with way too little power to be able to regulate the relationships between the states, and that needs to change. Now, Thomas Jefferson could have actually done most of this. However, fate intervened. Jefferson was in France serving as the minister to France and wasn't present for the writing of the Constitution. Madison, as kind of his political tutti and associate, would kind of serve in his place as being the writer of the bulk of the document. And that's because George Washington, there was delegations from each of the states, and Virginia sent its own delegation, which included Madison and Washington. Washington believed that Madison would be the best person to write up and create a draft for a new form of government that would be more unifying, have more centralized power, and be able to handle the issues within and between the states. And so Madison writes most of the Constitution. This is why he earns the moniker the father of the Constitution, because at the behest of George Washington and because Thomas Jefferson is not there. So what did he think of the natives? I'm not sure. Not extraordinarily. Madison does not have the best civil rights record by any stretch, but he definitely doesn't have an extraordinarily paternalistic view of the natives, from what I understand of it. The natives were seen oftentimes as enemies and rivals of American and colonial and their interests. So Madison's relationship with the natives was not great, and during his presidency, there's going to be many different fallouts between the natives during the War of 1812, which will impact his legacy. And even before then, Madison will be commissioning generals like William Henry Harrison a future president, to go and fight against the natives, the Shawnee tribe led by Tecumseh in 1811, and the Shawnee will continually fight against the Americans during the War of 1812. So Adams and Jefferson are not present, two of the most formidable founding fathers, two of the main authors of the Declaration of Independence. But Benjamin Franklin is there from the Pennsylvania delegation. The meeting is held in Philadelphia. And throughout the summer of 1787, there is a bunch of debates and a bunch of back and forth. And it's basically a debate over many of Madison's proposed ideas within the Constitution. The original Constitution did not have 10 amendments. Amendments means changes anyways, that guaranteed individual rights. Those were added later. Madison wrote those as well. In fact, he wrote 12 of them, and only 10 of them eventually ended up getting approved by the Constitutional Convention as it came to be known. The meeting originally, by the way, was supposed to be a redrafting and a revising of the Articles of Confederation, but Washington and several others believed that it was better just to come up with a brand new government, and so commissioned the very intellectual, very well-written and very polished James Madison to do this. So this is where Madison rises in the political level to be on the same par as other founding fathers like Washington and Ben Franklin. Another founding father who's on the rise at this time is Alexander Hamilton from the New York delegation, who had served in the war. Hamilton is several years younger than Madison, and this creates one of the most interesting political relationships in American history that we don't talk about enough. The erstwhile friendship that later became a bitter rivalry between Madison and his faction and Hamilton. However, at first, the two men worked together tirelessly to create a strong federal government that is able to regulate the issues between the states and can actually control the different political challenges of the nation and actually have centralized authority, be able to command the military, be able to take care of, regulate commerce, create a standard currency, and settle many of the issues left over socially and economically from the American Revolution. Madison comes up with several different models for government that are put to the test, revised, and edited, and eventually find their final form in what the Constitution itself becomes. But it's James Madison who writes most of it, of what becomes the major sections of the documents. So Madison is brilliant enough to come up with a large portion of the American system. The American federal system that has existed for 240 years and done pretty well at existing for 240 years owes a lot of its survival in the sense of a federal government and its relationship with the states, the federalism of the United States, to the workings of James Madison, who came up with the first draft of it. Of course, his plan for government, for the legislative branch, which he believed should be the strongest of all branches, heavily influenced, by the way, by French Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and especially Montesquieu. Madison advocated for separate branches of government, where different branches would have different powers and work with each other to not only help each other, but check each other to make sure no one got too powerful. Borrowing from Montesquieu, Madison is the one who basically believes that government should be divided into different sections, which is why the United States does not become a parliamentary system like the British government is. The Americans are very hesitant to basically carbon copy the British, despite the fact that the British have an unspoken constitution, and of course they also have a Bill of Rights. The Americans kind of take a lot from the British model, but decide to divide things up. And this is Madison being influenced by Montesquieu. This is why the president is not the head of the legislative branch; he's the head of the executive branch, and the party in power does not control through democratic means a significant section of the. No, we didn't. Harry, you are wrong. Yes, elected and equal. And the House of Lords does not have nearly as much power as the U.S. Senate. So there is a bicameral nature to the British Parliament that the Americans do indeed use. But Madison wants he comes up with his own plan for what a legislative branch looks like, and this leads to some of the greatest debates for the U.S. Constitution. And the first lens for that is what's called the Virginia Plan, where there will be two chambers of government, so a bicameral legislature, and they will both be based on population size. One will be an older, more mature faction called the Senate, and one will be a younger faction that's more populous called the House of Representatives. This is eventually changed in what's called the Great Compromise, where the Senate is based on equal representation for the 13 colonies, and the House is based on population size. But Madison is the one who originally came up with the bicameral system. Yes, they do. There is a lot of carryover from the British system. Madison is influenced by the British system, by the Romans, by the Greeks, and by French philosophers. So Madison takes his huge knowledge, his incredible apparatus of knowledge about political philosophy, both British and French, and also ancient Greek and Roman, and applies it to how he writes and comes up with the American system. What this shows is a man who is very intellectually capable, very quick on his feet, and very mentally brilliant. Madison realized that in creating a bicameral legislature, he would create a level of gridlock, a level of competition, a level of dissent that would sometimes occur in the different government levels. Yes, but it doesn't have that power now, Harry, so stop talking. Anyways, point being, the U.S. Senate has just as much power as it did in 1790. The House of Lords does not. And the House of Lords has become distinct because it relates to people with nobility and the landed gentry of the early modern period. That wasn't necessarily the goal of the American founders. However, the point being with James Madison is that he envisions an American system where you have a more mature, older House in the Senate, an older part of Congress that is the Senate that is more mature, smaller, and able to deal with bigger political issues. And basically Madison creates the basis for how senators work. Senators are elected by legislatures. Legislatures select senators. So because legislatures select senators, they are more detached from the general population. The group that works for people's individual and direct rights and ideas and demands is the House of Representatives. That's why it's people don't have to be citizens as long. The citizenship requirements are less strenuous. The age requirements, you have to be 25 to be a member of the House, 30 to be a member of the Senate. This is because Madison, like many of the founding fathers, envisioned the Senate being the older, more mature, less connected directly to the people, where the House of Representatives spoke more or less on the age and maturity of the senators, where the House is based more on interpersonal, more personal connection to the actual population. So Madison has quite the stroke of genius in doing this, but he is not done with his intellectual contributions to the Americans, to the creation of the American system. The Virginia Plan is not adopted; it's eventually compromised. Madison doesn't get two houses of Congress based on population population size, but one based on equal representation and one based on population size, which is the House of Representatives, which more directly represents the people anyways. So at the end of the day, Madison's original drafts are edited and changed in certain regards. Madison does play with and toy with the idea of ending slavery, of adding a provision to end slavery. However, eventually the 3/5 compromise is adopted, which basically says that slaves are counted as 3/5 of a person towards congressional districting. What this meant was that the southern states slaves had no franchise, no power of voting, but they only counted towards 60% of a regular person. Now, this wasn't necessarily a value judgment, but more of an idea, and I think it was Franklin who came up with this idea, that basically slaves would not be able to vote either way. There would be fewer people counted if some people only counted as 60%. So the slaves themselves not being able to vote, you wouldn't give more congressional power and more House seats, more seats in that house, the lower chamber of Congress, the House of Representatives, to southern states. So this actually weakened the power of southern states to have more seats in Congress that were only voted on exclusively by white males, many of whom owned land. Originally, by the way, in the United States, there were land restrictions on who could vote. Only white men who owned a certain amount of land could vote, and until the 1820s, that stayed the case. It was eventually decided that all white men could vote. They eventually all gained the franchise, and there were no requirements to own a certain amount of land to allow you to vote. You just had to be a white male citizen. Of course, later this is extended to minorities after the Civil War in particular, and eventually to women as well by 1920. What else was I going to say? What percentage was a slave counted as? 3/5. 60%. So that meant if you were, and I'll just explain it real fast because it can be confusing otherwise. This wasn't actually made to give value on the slaves and say that they were inferior, but it was to limit the political power of the southern states, so they would have less members of Congress representing only the interests of white slave-owning males, which included men like James Madison. But the truth of the matter is, if you had a home and you had 5 slaves in that home, when you were counted in a census every 10 years, which was also set up by Madison in the Constitutional Convention and the way he wrote the Constitution, or a bulk of it, basically those 5 slaves would count as 3 people. So they would be counted towards representation. So instead of counting all 5 of them and none of them getting the right to vote, 3 out of 5 of them would be counted, and they still wouldn't have any political power. So why wasn't there a push to return the slaves back to Africa? There was. There was before and after slavery ended. I'm not going to. I'm not going to be interacting with the chat too much. I'm only answering questions that are directly related to what I am lecturing on. But please like and subscribe if you haven't. We might have time for Q&A at the end. Yeah. Well, I don't care how I pronounce ever. You just listen. What happens next? Madison is rewarded for this by getting to write more. Many people, there emerge 2 factions within the Constitution, and the Constitution is ratified in September, but there's a definite faction of leadership throughout the country that feels that this Constitution has made the central government too powerful and that the Articles of Confederation just needed to be improved, and they become known as the Anti-Federalists, and Madison becomes the leader of a group known as the Federalists, and this includes people like Alexander Hamilton and another rising founding father who helped write part of the Constitution, a man named John Jay. Madison, Hamilton, and Jay team up to write a series of tracts together called the Federalist Papers, which encourage legislatures in the different states to ratify the Constitution and why it is important for the government, for a centralized, a strong, divided balance of powers government, federal government to oversee the different states, and why a federal system where you have the federal government having the most power and the states being subsidiary but having their own individual powers was best. So basically, these are a series of arguments made by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay to push for the ratification of the Constitution. Madison writes most of these, and I think it's 51, Fed number 51. They're numbered essays, is where he makes probably his most famous political contribution and argument. If men were angels, there would be no need for government, but humans are not angels. Madison also believes that there will be various factions who arise who only want political power and only want to fulfill the demands of the people who represent them. This is kind of a hint at populism and demagoguery, and Madison basically says by having a balance of powers, you can limit the amount of self-interest in government and the amount of people out for themselves or out for a particular group of people who are seeking to cause damage or simply just acquire greed, wealth, and power. My whole point is that James Madison is not. Madison makes these two famous essays. He writes most of the essays in the Federalist Papers, and these arguments are central to why the American system has a balance of powers. This doesn't satisfy, and why America needs a federal system. And they're two of his most important contributions and arguments. Perhaps his most important contribution, however, is coming next. The Anti-Federalists and many people in state legislatures who are voting to ratify the Constitution, 9 out of the 13 states needed to ratify it for it to become the new law of the land. Eventually, all 13 of them did. But a lot of people in these legislatures are still quite hesitant and still opposed to the Federalists like Hamilton and Madison and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. So the compromise that they demand, people like George Mason and Thomas Jefferson himself opposes Madison briefly on this. And they write to each other quite frequently. They have become very, very close friends and will maintain a very, very close friendship. They're two intellectuals. They're two men who are obsessed with political theory. They're two men who borrow greatly from ancient Greece and ancient Rome and the British and French political philosophical traditions of the Enlightenment to influence their ideas. They're very similar in some of their religious ideas. They are obviously land-owning slaveholders who have a huge conflict of interest between freedom and the rights of man versus owning slaves. So they're very, very similar in that regard. They are not similar in many other regards. Madison is kind of a quiet ho-hum sort of fellow. Jefferson is an inventor. He's charismatic. Of course, he's well known for his many affairs, some of which were with his slaves. But Madison is what Madison and Jefferson clash a little bit on this issue, and they'll quickly reconcile. And Jefferson is the one who encourages Madison that basically the only way you're going to guarantee individual rights with this Constitution is to stipulate what those rights are. And this leads to Madison writing 12, I think it might have been 13 or 12 originally, Bill of Rights, amendments to the Constitution that guarantee certain individual rights. The first one is probably the most famous, where 5 of the major rights, including religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition, are guaranteed by the U.S. government. The second one is probably the most controversial, guaranteeing the right to bear arms. The 10th Amendment deals a heavy blow to the Anti-Federalists who oppose the Constitution by saying that whatever rights are not enumerated being given to the federal government belong to the states. And so from this, Madison is able to become writes this. It eventually is trimmed down to 10, and those really make it a lot more an easier pill for people to swallow when accepting a federal system and the creation of a constitution, because this constitution also immediately guarantees the individual rights of man. What happens next? Madison becomes a leader in the House of Representatives, and Thomas Jefferson becomes Secretary of State under George Washington's presidency. Madison also helped create the judiciary and executive branches, and Madison will become an ally with Jefferson in visiting the White House. Madison will eventually abandon many of the Federalist principles that he thought were important, as Alexander Hamilton becomes a huge fan of a strong central government. Madison kind of goes back to his Virginia dynasty days and to being brought up by Thomas Jefferson and this tradition of individual rights in government. So he's going to favor more of an anti-federalist position that becomes known as the Republicans, not the modern Republican Party, but they are called the Republicans. They've also been called the Democratic Republicans, and they are going to advocate a small government, strong emphasis on individual rights, and a dependence on what Jefferson calls the yeoman farmer, the countryside, the ordinary people, to make their own decisions and to be unadulterated by the government throughout that. Um, so, um, what happens next? Jefferson or Madison um, after working with him, becomes an opponent of Hamilton. He sides with Jefferson in a lot of this. He also seeks to advance a political agenda through the court system. And this leads to one of the most famous rulings, which is a ruling against him in Supreme Court history. If you want to learn more about the Supreme Court, check out my long-form videos. I've been doing a series currently for everyone on the channel, for everyone, on the Supreme Court. But McCulloch versus Madison, the 1803 ruling, basically establishes the Supreme Court's right, or the judiciary's right, to strike down laws that are unconstitutional or uphold laws that they deem to be constitutional, creating the principle and precedent of judicial review, where the Supreme Court and other courts get to decide if a law will stand or fall. This is part of their interpretive powers according to the third article of the Constitution. This is ruled on by John Marshall, who is a Federalist, who believes in a strong federal government, and it is frustrating to Madison, or it's not McCulloch versus, it's, was it Marbury versus Madison? Marbury versus Madison, I think it's called. And this is frustrating to Madison, who helped write this original system and now is kind of gone on a 180 and now is being opposed by Federalists everywhere he goes. Jefferson is elected president in 1800, and Madison becomes his Secretary of State, which is kind of a stepping stone to the White House. Jefferson himself had been Washington's Secretary of State and then ran a very close battle against John Adams, eventually being elected president in his own right in 1800. Madison remains Jefferson's Secretary of State for his 8 years. This is an extremely important time to be Secretary of State because the rising tensions between Britain and France in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars leads to impressment, the seizing of American cargo, American ships, and sometimes even American sailors by both the British and the French. Madison and Jefferson are more sympathetic to the values of the French, especially because Jefferson was a huge fan of the Republican experiment through the French Revolution, although he eventually realized that really hadn't turned out as well as he had liked, and he had a less great opinion of Napoleon, but was more than willing to double the size of the United States by buying the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon in 1803, which is negotiated with James Madison and another Virginian who was the minister to France at the time, a man named James Monroe. So the Virginia dynasty, all three members are currently president: Jefferson, Madison, and James Monroe. Again, all Republicans or Democratic Republicans who advocate for a weak central government, individual rights, and kind of lean into more of a rural farmer, working class vision of America, as opposed to the Federalists, who have the mercantile interests of New England shipping much more in their minds, which is obviously heavily hurt by the mishandling of by the impressment by British ships and things like this. But Jefferson doesn't seem to care about that. Eventually, Jefferson bans all trade with the Embargo Act, which is so horribly unpopular and so devastating to New England, to the New England economy and to the Southern economy, which relies on exports of cotton, that it is eventually repealed when Madison becomes president in 1809. Riding the coattails of one of the greatest presidents in U.S. history is an easy way to become president, and so it is that James Madison is elected the fourth president in 1808. Again, a very contrasted figure, not the celebrity, not the likable charisma of a George Washington or a Thomas Jefferson, but part of that OG founding father tradition. Even if he came in kind of as a second generation part of that, working on his credentials speak for themselves. He wrote a lot of the Constitution. He wrote most of the Federalist Papers. He wrote the Bill of Rights. Madison was a congressional member. He fought in the courts. He was the Secretary of State. He has an extremely good pedigree. He's elected president, and more on his intellectual prowess than on anything that would be considered charisma. Now, this isn't to say that James Madison is a mean and unlikable person. He's very quiet, very demure. And I think he would have gotten along very well with anyone who would have loved to talk political philosophy with him, like me. But this doesn't mean that Madison's White House is boring. Madison's wife hosts these elaborate and festive parties where guests are treated to all sorts of different courses of food and drink, and people get kind of wild. And the president kind of sits there quietly and kind of watches and takes it all in, and then retires so that he can go read. He likes to only be around for a little while and then leave, but he doesn't want to embarrass his wife. Him and Dolly, he loves Dolly very much. They're very close to one another, despite being the absolute polar opposites and having 17 years apart between them. And again, like I mentioned before, if you want to learn more about Dolly Madison and the history of the First Lady, subscribe to my Patreon, which my wonderful moderator Hars put in the chat. So, let me see, what else? The issue continues to remain. Britain and France are still at war. There seems to be no end in sight. Napoleon continues to try to bankrupt Britain. The capturing of American ships, cargo, and sailors is being ramped up by the British, who are dealing with a dearth of economic trade and commercialism from the continent. So the tensions have gotten very high, and Madison is now dealing with a new generation of politicians who are really, really pressing for war and have become leading members of the Republican Party, or the Democratic Republican Party. Daniel Webster, and most notably, a young man named Henry Clay, who a leading member of the House of Representatives, is pushing for war in the year 1812. So James Madison, in June of 1812, eventually gives in and asks Congress for a declaration of war, becoming the first U.S. president to do so. The United States goes to war, and the war is unimaginatively named the War of 1812, which will really be the measure of Madison's reputation. Madison, in some ways, like John Adams, is measured heavily based off of what he did before he was president rather than what he did during his presidency. That doesn't take away from the fact that Madison's presidency, other than the struggles of the War of 1812, was relatively successful for the most part. The United States was growing and becoming more prosperous. New states were being added. Territories were being explored. And this idea of developing commercial highways, canals, roads, and bridges, which will eventually become known as the American system, has become quite popular for the Democratic Republicans. Once again, like Jefferson, limiting the amount of the federal government, cutting the U.S. debt, which had been created by Hamilton in the 1790s. These are huge goals of Madison, and he's actually able to achieve them. So domestically, the Madison presidency is quite successful in order to pave way and pave safe travels and ways for explorers and pioneers in the West, or what's called now the Midwest. He sends William Henry Harrison to defeat the army of Tecumseh and the Shawnee Indians along the Ohio River Valley, and this leads to the famous victory at Tippecanoe. So Madison's presidency is quite successful. And then there's the War of 1812, which is what he is judged heavily for. Now, there are people who, for some reason, believe the War of 1812 was a success for the United States. And while it is true that the United States did not suffer heavily at the hands of the British after the war, the United States didn't seem to do too well during the war. Another failed invasion of Canada went absolutely nowhere. The Americans had their own land in the Ohio River Valley invaded. Detroit was taken by the British, a fort at the time. The British eventually corner the market with their extremely impressive navy, which had been really good at defeating Napoleon, of all people, and land at the Chesapeake Bay and send a force to Washington, D.C. Madison and his wife are barely able to escape, with Dolly Madison, and I forget the name of the man, but incorporating the use of a White House slave, because yes, there were White House slaves. Presidents brought their slaves with them to the White House. To bring down the famous portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart, probably the most famous painting of any U.S. president, and save it. She actually sets a table so that the British troops can eat there. And when the British troops are done eating there, they set fire to the White House and to the U.S. Capitol building. Madison is forced to flee, barely making it out in time. And he is kind of blamed for getting the U.S. involved in a war with a power they didn't expect to take on. The U.S. survived. Wow, that's surprising. I didn't know the U.S. survived this war. It was incredible. Living here all my life, I wouldn't have any idea the U.S. survived the War of 1812. So the British, basically more focused on defeating Napoleon, which happens in 1814 and again in 1815. Check out my long-form video on Napoleon. In fact, Hars, why don't you make yourself useful with the War of 1812 right now and post my long-form video about Napoleon, which everyone can check out if they want to look at the European side of what's going on. Madison is basically able to get away without too much punishment. The Treaty of Ghent is signed in December of 1814, and this ends the war. A couple weeks later, by the way, another U.S. president, a man named John Quincy Adams, is the minister who is sent to Ghent, and the Secretary of State is James Monroe. So the next three presidents have been lined up: President, Secretary of State, and Foreign Secretary, or Foreign Minister. So the British basically decide that they have bigger fish to fry, and they're not going to be obsessed with punishing the Americans, although it's pretty obvious the Americans lost their war because London wasn't burned, but the White House, but Washington, D.C. sure was. Oh, and the Americans lost the vast majority of battles they fought in the war. The United States does get two major consolations out of it that do contribute to the legacy of James Madison. You could argue that his wife doing what she did kind of bolsters his presidential legacy and the legacy of the Madison White House. They live in a house called the Octagon for the rest of his presidency while the White House is being rebuilt. But Madison, but the at Fort McHenry, which was a fort being attacked by bombarded by the British in Maryland, the American forces are able to actually withstand a British onslaught, and eventually a young lawyer writes lyrics to a poem that later becomes the Star-Spangled Banner about the fort being able to survive against all odds from a British bombardment. A very, very patriotic moment in American history when Francis Scott Key pens the words to the Star-Spangled Banner, which is given music later on. It was originally just a poem. Yes, Madison created the Second Bank of the United States. Moving on. He renewed the charter. Yes, I know that. Anyways, moving on. In 1815, and then in January of 1815, with the war being officially over, but them not knowing because the internet didn't exist, yes, there was a time before the internet existed. A young rising star general who becomes a legend in American history named Andrew Jackson, who will be president in his own right, he defeats the British in an overwhelming, surprising victory at the Battle of New Orleans, where the British were trying to seize an American port with a much larger force. They lose. Jackson becomes a hero, and America gets away with a couple of consolation prizes from the War of 1812, which was otherwise kind of embarrassing. Madison is not embarrassed, though. His reputation is still intact. He is seen as an architect of the American Republic, and in many ways, yes, I do remember you. And in many ways, the truth of the matter is that James Madison's legacy as a president falls under the shadow of his legacy as a founding father, the man who created the very system that would support a presidency, a Congress, and a judiciary, got to serve in that position for 8 years, and did a relatively capable job, and probably shouldn't have gotten the United States involved in a war, but there was no way that he could have seen Napoleon being defeated in 2 years and the impressment coming to an end and the British having no reason to punish the United States anymore by seizing their cargo. The end of the continental system, where Britain was allowed to once again trade with the continent in 1815, kind of escaped the Madison. This is just a point that you can't always predict the future, and what seems like a bad decision at one point because of hindsight shouldn't be held against somebody, because Madison had no idea that the French were going to lose, the British were going to win, the continental system would end, and the need to seize American ships, cargo, and sailors would come to a halt in 1814 and 1815. So, yes. Anyways, I think that's basically it. I'll talk a little bit about what happens to James Madison afterwards, but I have to charge my phone. So, Madison leaves the White House in 1817, following the tradition of one of his favorite people, George Washington, the man who trusted him. Again, a lot of James Madison's story would not be possible without him receiving the trust and the blessing of two of America's greatest figures, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. So the very fact that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington trusted James Madison tells you exactly the kind of stock that he was, considering his political knowledge, but also his ability to solve complex issues. Madison could have been an excellent president if he hadn't been surrounded by war. He won't ever get the recognition of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson for his time in the Oval Office because of that. But if the United States had remained domestically peaceful, Madison's presidency probably would be much higher ranked, considering the fact that he is, of course, one of the most important people in early American history. By the time he left office, the United States had turned away from the War of 1812, and in many ways, with him leaving office, the United States had turned away from the generations of the Founding Fathers, either the first or second wave of Founding Fathers who had created the American system. Washington was dead, Jefferson was extremely old, Adams was also extremely old. Madison himself will kind of retire from public life. He'll become a writer, and he will help Thomas Jefferson found the University of Virginia and become the second president of the University of Virginia after Jefferson dies in 1826. The truth of the matter is, although James Monroe in many ways is a founding father and another president who does, I think I've done a live stream lecture on him. He certainly deserves one if I haven't. Madison's presidency, by the way, will be dwarfed by Monroe's, will be sandwiched between Jefferson's, which is extremely successful, and Monroe's, which is extremely underrated. Madison's is kind of just there. But in many ways, the United States is turning its attention towards industrialization in the Northeast, westward expansion, and the growing issue of slavery. The Second Great Awakening and the social movements of the 19th century are just around the corner. So by the time Madison leaves the White House in 1817, America is a very different system than it was 30 years ago when he was writing the Constitution. So if you look at the perspective of the United States from James Madison, he left power, he left politics 30 years after really entering it on the grand scale, in a much bigger, better place than it had been, and the United States in a much more stable position than it had been. Despite some ridiculous historical rumors that the British were using the War of 1812 to recolonize America, which isn't true, the truth of the matter is the United States was basically going to be left on its own. The British deciding to show clemency to the U.S. because they no longer needed to impress U.S. sailors, and they did not punish the United States for the War of 1812, basically meant the United States was kind of on its own. This created a system of semi-isolationism the United States would use to grow in their conquest of the rest of the continent for the next 35 years. Of course, the truth of the matter is this will also include Monroe, Madison's successor, writing the Monroe Doctrine, and the United States going to war with Mexico and a bunch of Indian nations as well, so it's not fully as isolationist as you might think. Let's see. Madison ends up by dying in 1836 at the age of 85. A good long life. His wife Dolly is forced to sell Montpelier, his famous plantation and estate, taking only a handful of the remaining slaves with her to Washington, D.C., where she will live and kind of be a relic of the American past and someone who everyone still loves and greatly admires. In many ways, her reputation is better than that of her husband's at the time. She will die in 1848 at the age of 81 or 81. She's 16 or 17 years younger than him. That's basically it. James Madison's legacy is kind of buried today because people don't always pay attention to the nerds in history. They don't pay attention to the intellectuals. If we think of the American founding, we think of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Ben Franklin. But James Madison certainly deserves a spot up there as well. In my opinion, he's probably the most important founding father other than Washington. He's my personal favorite founding father. His presidency isn't incredible, but it isn't bad either. It doesn't deserve to be lambasted because of the War of 1812. It's not really his fault. He gave into a growing faction of war hawks who were sick and tired of a problem that predated him by 20 years, with Adams and Jefferson both struggling with this before him. So at the end of the day, Madison is an important figure. Of course, we also have to mention the social aspect. Madison did not free the slaves. Madison knew that slavery was wrong. Madison, like Jefferson, had many complex views about slavery and its role in American history. The Jay Treaty really has nothing to do with James Madison. It strengthened British and American relations in the 1790s and was made by John Jay right before he returned to the United States to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Or maybe it was right after he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And of course, as for Alexander Hamilton, he would be killed by Aaron Burr, who was vice president and part of the cabinet under Thomas Jefferson when Madison served there. And of course, Madison hated the Jay Treaty. He wasn't a big fan of the British, went to war with them 20 years later. Yep, that was a lot of the plantation owners. Not a lot of them, but a lot of the founders owned slaves and understood there was a moral complexity and problem with owning slavery, and that slavery wasn't the best thing. They also many of them believed that slaves were better off in their care than the care of someone who would be overtly cruel to them. And some argued so much so that the slaves would be left with no skills, no resources, and basically to a hostile world if they were freed in the South. And that's what Jefferson believed, and I think Madison did too. So it's not going to be, it's not as easy as he's just being a greedy plantation owner. Madison had more than enough wealth. This belief that of paternalism, the slaves were better off in slavery than being freed in a racist South, was prominent, and also this idea that we don't know how wrong slavery actually is. It seems to be wrong, but we're not sure. And the British Navy was pretty invincible at the time. So, anyways, questions about history or social studies. We went about 50 minutes. I know it says 44, but we were going for about 10 minutes before that, trying to figure out our live stream issues. So I've got about 10 more minutes of questions and answers. Let me see here. That's true, kneecappers. Can the next live stream lecture vote be James Monroe? Maybe, I don't know. I've done a lot of presidents. There's a lot of other topics I've wanted to cover. Why was it so imperative to fill the role of First Lady of the U.S. if a POTUS wife died? It seems everyone in the early U.S. quickly staffed this with a daughter, niece, daughter-in-law. Jefferson put his niece in charge, or his daughter-in-law. His daughter-in-law? No, it was his stepdaughter. It was his stepdaughter, his wife's daughter. James Buchanan put his niece. It's this idea of you need a hostess, you need a good image. The president and his wife, especially in early America, are seen in a kind of a patriarchal role as kind of having a parentage over the U.S. government, over the U.S. people. So you need a good representative of that. You need a hostess for your parties. You need somebody to represent a more delicate side, rather than just the hardcore political issues that the president is dealing with. So for them, it was very consequential to the nation's image, but also to the prestige of the nation and to the politicking, to be able to welcome and host people who you needed to welcome and host and help people. And by the way, back then you could go to the White House White House had office hours. You can meet the president. Yes. Yeah, we've done TR, we've done FDR, we've done Nixon, we did James Madison. I think we did Monroe, and of course I've done George Washington. Hello, Faraz, good to see you. Hello, Crystal. Thank you for joining us from Sicily. British ruined world history. Well, not according to the British. So there's people on this channel who will smite you if you have that opinion, but I understand why you have that opinion. Let me see here. Other questions? Let me see. Yeah, I'm good. I don't have to say your name. What's the role of the first man of the United States if we ever see one? To be masculine as the foil female U.S. president? I don't know. I imagine that it would be similar to a first lady in the sense of hosting events and things like that. It might be more of a masculine version of what the first lady does. First ladies in modern U.S. presidential history have this ability to monitor different events and affairs. They have a cause they work on. I imagine a U.S. president, U.S. first gentleman probably would be doing something similar, focusing on a particular cause, raising awareness for it, hosting events, welcoming dignitaries, things like that. But I want you to know I am waiting for you to respond to my emails in no rush. Oh, yes, I will, probably sometime this week. I do need to do the Industrial Revolution video. That'll probably come out tomorrow. That's for members only. I also have I have a couple of videos to make tomorrow. Who has the best history ever? In my opinion, the Russians, but I love almost every history I come into, all shorts. How are the pyramids in Egypt built? We don't fully know. I think a lot of manpower being compelled to do it over years allowed it to happen. I just quit talking in friendly history about the War of 1812 because it's like me talking to a brick wall. Ditto. Yes, and the brick wall that is Harsonet will not change his mind because he doesn't want to admit simple facts. Why aren't you mentioning the importance of France's assistance that led to its victory? French assistance? In the American Revolution, yes, absolutely. The French are extremely important. The United States wouldn't have won the war without the French. Go and watch my videos on that. I've talked about it a lot. In fact, Hars put up the video of the French Revolution. And Tom, I want you to go watch that video, and I talk about that. I talk about how that helped America but bankrupted the French. I do believe that the Americans wouldn't have gotten free from the British without the French. Was there any written history as to why Madison married Dolly since she was so much younger than him and were complete opposites? I don't know. I think this is not uncommon in that era. I think she was the daughter of a friend. I don't know much more. I don't know exactly how they met. Thank you, Kay. That's very kind to have you here and say that. Thank you for sharing that about Australia. I need to learn more about Australia's history. I really, really do. I feel like if you let your capital burn from a foreign army, you have indeed lost the war. How can people say that the War of 1812 somehow a win? It's not a, I don't think people think it's a win, but they just don't want to focus on America losing the war. The fact the U.S. didn't get punished severely makes it a win. I wouldn't say it's an overwhelming, devastating loss, but it's a loss nonetheless. Well, I have a question. When there is a war, the country that is attacked have a rally around a flag effect like how it happened in Vietnam, but for America, it was the opposite. Well, at first, America, whenever a country starts off at war, patriotism usually skyrockets. The Russian Revolution was caused partially by them losing mightily to the Germans in the Great War, and the Germans wanting to use Lenin as a way to destroy the Russian government and bring them out of the war. The Bolsheviks also begged the Imperial Germans to keep them in power. It's all true, but at first the patriotism skyrocketed. The Tsar drafted 15 million soldiers, and half of them were obliterated one way or another, killed, wounded, captured. Are white people superior? Thank you for asking a very, very, very leading question that you probably got while watching another streamer lecture and say a bunch of curse words, but no. If history teaches us anything, it's that white people are not superior, and neither are black people, or Indian people, or Asian people, or Mexican people, or Hispanics, or any group of people, or Jews, or Gentiles. No one's superior. People all mess up in terrible ways and all achieve incredible things in amazing ways. Yeah, Dolly was married before, I think. Yeah, that's actually, I think, true. During American Civil War, it was South that was attacked and Union that did the attack. Then why was it the Union that felt the rally around the flag and the South experience? And that's not true. That's a misconception. The South attacked the North first. Look at Fort Sumter. And that flag from Fort Sumter was brought to New York as a rallying cry so Lincoln could get 75,000 volunteers. I want to know about 2,000 years ago, the approximate history of advancement of civilization. I don't have enough time to talk to you about that. That would not be one live stream lecture. That'd be like 5 live stream lectures. But if you look at the advancements technologically in human civilization over the last 200 years, they dwarf the advancements exponentially of the previous 5,000 years. And if you look at the advancements in the digital age over the last 30 years, they dwarf the Industrial Revolution of the previous 2 centuries, the same way the Industrial Revolution dwarfs the developments in the last 5,000 years of technology before that. In other words, we're growing far more exponentially quicker in 30 years than we did in the previous 200, which was already exponentially bigger than it was for the previous 5,000 years in human society, which obviously technological growth is huge. Okay, so, and there we go. French Revolution, go take a look at it. Let me see. Harry and Hars are arguing. What a surprise. There's always a better Chinese. I don't know what you mean by that. Let me see here. Hi, bro. You heard... Yes, I don't know what you're referring to by the Bible, but okay. I thought the French were involved in 1812. My mistake. They are not. Why, when the American Civil War went on north, experienced rally around the flag? I already answered that. When and how did the British recognize America as an independent country? 1783, Treaty of Paris. 1782, they decide to stop fighting. The victory against Cornwallis at Yorktown basically ends the fighting section of the war. For 2 years, they work on peace treaties. Honestly, America is the most like the Dutch or the other way around. The Dutch founded New York and New Jersey. Let me see here. Did you eat a history book? No, but I absorbed it. Let me see. Well, anyways, we're at 52 minutes, which we went 10 minutes before, so we're just over an hour. So once again, I've gone over an hour with the lecture and then with answering questions. Let me see here. And blindly supporting the Union isn't perfectly black and white. There's lots of nuance with how Southerners feel about it. That's true. Had a great time. Thank you, historian. Thank you, chat, for fantastic questions and Bond's good work. Yep, a very, very good time today. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're just over 60 minutes, so we went over again, but that's because you guys had great questions and we did a good lecture, so really appreciate that. Who has the best history? Chinese, Indian, and Egyptian. They are only oldest history. They're the oldest. That doesn't mean they have the best, but they are quite fascinating, all in their own way. And the extended live streams have been great. Yeah, it's been a really, really fun week. And we obviously have we had 2 live stream lectures. We had the special for Wednesday. We went live on TikTok briefly. I wasn't able to get any traction there, but please follow us on TikTok. That's there. Substack, Patreon. Like and subscribe on your way out. And we'll be back Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern and Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern next week for Q&A, where you can ask me anything you want about history or social studies. Yes. Well, thank you, Tom. I really appreciate that. And for the idiot who said that I'm trying to take Charlie Kirk's place, no, I am not.
just because I'm drinking a water bottle, wearing a t-shirt, and doing a lecture, and I'm white. And yes. Okay, so anyways, let me see here. Anyways, I hope you all have a very, very good week, and we'll be back Friday, 6 p.m. Eastern for more Q&A, Saturday, 6 p.m. Eastern for more Q&A after that, and next Sunday you get to vote here exclusively on YouTube on the topic that we will be discussing the live stream lecture for. And of course, check out the long form videos every Monday and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern. We have plenty of those, and we have shorts on the channel, short videos you can check out anytime you'd like. Thank you for joining us. Again, like and subscribe, become a friendly neighborhood historian. It's as easy as that on your way out. And I will see you guys very, very soon. Take care. Have a great week. And remember, as always, love history. Bye-bye, everybody.